gonna have to.
They've been trying to get some people get more.
I was wondering if I was gonna consider just getting the car dancing.
That's good. That's why I didn't remember.
I had the same, yeah.
Good. I'm glad you're here. About
Yeah, he's not feeling well.
No, you can't hear nothing like this.
exactly.
Well,
Welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. We are here with Rabbi Marc Katz, who is the rabbi at Temple Ner Tamid in Bloomfield, where he's been since 2018. He was in Brooklyn before that, but originally from Rhode Island. Rabbi Katz is the author of the book we're going to be speaking about tonight, Yochanan's Gamble, Judaism's Pragmatic Approach to Life, but also the author of a very different book, but also a very beautiful book, The Heart of Loneliness. We'll be selling this one later, but you can find this one on all places where you can find great Jewish books. Rabbi Katz and his wife Ayala live in Montclair. They have two very cute kids, and he says in his bio here, is excited to talk to you about what you are reading. And when he came into my office, he went right to the books to see what I was reading. So tonight we are going to talk about this book in specific, but maybe other books will come up. So I am going to be interviewing Rabbi Katz about the book, but then we'll have time for you all to ask questions too, and hopefully this will be just a free-flowing conversation. So first, all right, tell us about Yochanan's Gamble, or why don't you tell the story?
Yeah, so why do I call it Yochanan's Gamble? So Yochanan ben Zakkai is the father of Rabbinic Judaism. Now, what is Rabbinic Judaism? Rabbinic Judaism is the basically era of Judaism that was right around the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 CE, up through the next few centuries. And one of the things that happens during that time is a tremendous amount of creativity, right? The temple gets destroyed by the Romans, and suddenly the way that Jews used to do Judaism disappears. Once upon a time, Jews used to sacrifice in the temple. The emblematic Jewish leader was the priest. Israel was very Jerusalem focused. Judaism was very Jerusalem focused, in fact. And when that all ended, suddenly a group of people called the rabbis had to remake Judaism. They had to, and much, by the way, of what we know about Judaism comes out of the revolutions of these rabbis. The Passover Seder, for example, is modeled off of a Greek symposium, right? What is a Greek symposium? If you ever read, for example, Plato, you sit around, you talk about ideas, you eat food, and you drink wine. Well, what is a Passover Seder? You sit around, you talk about ideas, you eat food, and you drink wine. They created the prayer service and the prayer schedule, and they modeled the prayer schedule off the sacrificial schedule. We used to sacrifice 3 times a day when the temple was standing. After it was destroyed in 70 CE, we now pray 3 times a day. And so these are the rabbis, right? And the kind of founding myth of Rabbinic Judaism happens when, during the destruction of the temple, and a little bit to understand, there was a group of people who desperately wanted to fight the Romans and others that didn't. And if you know the geography of Jerusalem, it's up on a hill, and they could have outlasted the Romans for a really long time. But a group of people called the Zealots burned the stores of food, so people started starving. So they had to open up the gates and had to fight the Romans in order to bring more food in. And it was during that moment, right before they ended up opening the gates, that the story goes that Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was an important leader within a group of people who become the rabbis, sneaks out of Jerusalem and ends up having an audience with Vespasian, who at the time is the governor. And while he meets Vespasian, he says to Vespasian, basically, "Hail Caesar." And Vespasian looks at him and says, "What are you talking about? I'm the governor. I'm not Caesar." And no sooner does he say this, right, the founding myth of Rabbinic Judaism, then someone runs in and basically says, "Guess what? Good news. Caesar's dead. Long live you, the new emperor of Rome." And so he's on his way out the door to Rome, and he turns to Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he says to him, "Look, I have to imagine that this prophecy of yours, assuming that I was going to be the Caesar, had something to do with it. So ask me for anything, and I'll give it to you as I'm heading out the door." And Yochanan thinks about it, And he says, okay, I want three things. I want a little plot of land in a place called Yavne, just south of here, where I can restart Judaism after you destroy the temple. And I want these two other rabbis saved, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Zadok. And, you know, the new Caesar thinks about it and he says, yeah, you got it. And from there, Yochanan ben Zakkai essentially saves Judaism, right? He creates this school for all of these refugees out of Jerusalem that basically remakes Judaism after the temple is destroyed. But there's a postscript to the story where Rabbi Akiva, a couple generations later, says in the course of the Talmud, what a jerk. This guy had the emperor of Rome's ear. He could have asked him for anything. He should have asked him for what? To save Jerusalem, right? To stop the siege of the temple. And the anonymous voice of the Talmud comes in afterwards and says he asked for the thing he knew he could get, not the thing that he really wanted, but was likely to fall short of, and then would have squandered his request. And so that idea of this kind of pragmatic gamble, the idea of incrementalism, taking the thing you can get, not the thing you really want, the messy compromises, the weighing of competing values, the understanding the power structures at play, all of them become part and parcel of the way Jewish law and Jewish ethics work from the moment of Yochanan ben Zakkai moving forward. And so the book explores that way of thinking, partly as an antidote to the world we live in today, where honestly, everyone is standing on their soapboxes, screaming at each other. Nobody's compromising. It's my way or the highway. Everyone thinks they're right. And in fact, if you read and study the rabbis, it gives you this window into this other way of being, which is what the world desperately needs right now.
So I'm going to ask, so you call it pragmatism, and then not, asking for everything as a gamble, but it's like when I think of the word gamble, I think a gamble is like something that's very risky. So is pragmatism risky? Wouldn't it be more risky if he tried to, get everything?
Yeah, I mean, so I picked gamble because it was a provocative word. But honestly, I think that, when you go gambling, you're always assessing the risks and the odds, right? I mean, anyone, for example, who plays roulette and instead of putting it down on a number, puts it down on a color, right? One of them is much more conservative than the other. You're gambling it both ways. It's just not, let's say, the riskier of the gamble.
So I mean, Rabbi Akiva is saying, generations later that Yochanan was being stupid, though, stupid for lack of a better term. It was like he should have, gone all in, right?
Yeah.
Why is Yochanan the hero?
Well, because we don't know, right? We can't have a time machine to know if he went all in, what would have happened. But it also could have been, the greatest miscalculation in Jewish history for him to ask something, for him to get told no, and then for Vespasian to get up and walk out. And by the way, Yochanan ben Zakkai doesn't know whether he did the right thing.
Right.
So one thing that I begin the book with this anecdote, but I end the book in a very different way. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is on his deathbed, and this is a story in the Talmud also, and he starts crying. And his students look at him and say to him, like, I don't understand. Like, look what you did. Like, we're here today because of you. You really think that, like, you're scared about meeting your maker? Because that's why he's crying. Because he doesn't know when he meets God, if God's going to look at him with disappointment or with pride. And he says, look, I don't know. And the only way I'm going to know is when I actually meet God. And so I'm going to die in fear that I didn't do the right thing. And I end by essentially saying that, like, life is full of these gambles, and that you do need to take leaps of faith, leaps of action to be able to function in this world. But you're never going to know that you did the right thing. And the problem with that kind of pragmatic way of thinking is that it's messier than that way, like than thinking you're in the right and just sticking to it. And so you're never going to know whether you did right. Most people, by the way, who are like in extreme tend to be able to sleep better at night because they're positive they're right. It's those people who are kind of in the middle, who are doing the Yochanan ben Zakkai thing, that it's those movements a little to the left or a little to the right that actually keep you up at night a lot more. But that's the way that the world works. And that's how you get stuff done.
So Jews on their deathbed, we shouldn't say no regrets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay. Well, let's take a step back first. And you kind of said that, talked about our time today. So why is this the right book for this time?
So let me take another step back and just tell you basically how I ended up writing this book, because it was an accident. So you can't really write a book by accident. You can't slip, fall, and write a book. But I meant to write a different book. So after my first book came out, which didn't sell at all, and because the publisher got sold.
You can still buy it.
Yes, the publisher got sold the month the book came out, and the new publisher just wanted the backlist, and so like didn't really push the book or do anything like that. And so I was pretty down, and I ended up meeting with the head of JPS, Barry Schwartz, who you may know, a mentor actually of your rabbi. I had seen on JPS's website, Jewish Publication Society's website, that they were commissioning a book on Judaism and integrity. And I said, well, I just bought one on loneliness. Why don't I write one on integrity? Like that's exploring some kind of thing, just like loneliness was. And so I sat down with him and he said, look, book's yours. Give me a proposal. If it's a good proposal, you got it. If it's not a good proposal, then you don't. But I won't take any proposals from anybody else. So I get your proposal. So I said, okay. So I went home, started researching, only to realize I can't write a book on Judaism integrity because I can't define integrity. Here, it's very difficult, actually. If integrity is sticking to your guns, right? Like really staying true to your values, then at the end of the day, I couldn't explain how a Nazi didn't have integrity. And
which is kind of Eichmann's argument too.
Yeah. And I don't think a Nazi has integrity. But if a Nazi doesn't have integrity, and integrity is just a fancy word for being ethical or moral, then why do you need a book on that? Why can't you just write a book that says be ethical and moral, right? And so I kept spinning and I couldn't figure it out. And at the same time, the more research I did, the more I realized actually that like traditional answers to what integrity is, Judaism doesn't have that. Right, Judaism is incredibly slippery, or at least Jewish law is incredibly slippery, right? They're like the rabbis are constantly changing things, and like if something doesn't work, they don't stick to it, they abandon it and find a new way to do it. And this book is filled with example after example of the rabbis who basically like are willing to completely throw things out and rethink things and do all of the things that seem different than what we would call integrity, right? And so the more I thought about it, the more that I realized, in fact, actually, that is not a bug of Judaism. That is a feature of Judaism, right? That's the good of Judaism, is that we are able to pivot, to make messy compromises, to move in one direction and then move in another. And so I was looking for a word for it. And that's when my father-in-law said to me, that kind of reminds me a little bit of Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so I dedicated the book actually to him because that was all I needed. That was the hook. And then I was able from there to kind of start exploring all of those, what I eventually landed on, which is pragmatic decisions on the part of the rabbis to make Judaism work, and Jewish law work, and Jewish ethics work in their really messy world.
So why you wrote the book? How about, let's take another step back. How does a congregational rabbi write a book? How do you find the time? You have two little kids.
Yeah. So I got a piece of advice from a mentor of mine, Larry Hoffman, who basically said like, if you always have things going in, then you'll usually be able to have things going out. So you just have to be a voracious reader first, right? And once you're able to do that, then the key is going to be that you need to write a book. Like you need to be disciplined and write a book in bite-sized pieces. I mean, as busy as we both are, you can find 30 minutes in a day to do something if it's important enough to you, but you have to be disciplined enough to just do the 30 minutes and then like stop, right? And sometimes in the 30 minutes, you only write a paragraph. And then sometimes in the 30 minutes, you write a lot. But if you're averaging about 500 words a day, that's 3,500 words a week. That's over 12,000 words a month. You blink and you got an 80,000 word book written. And you just have to kind of, you be disciplined enough. And if you don't write the book linearly, so that like, if you're reading in the meantime, and so you read something, you say, oh, that's an interesting text or an interesting idea. That would go really well in like chapter 7. So you write those 500 words and just trust that the next day, there's going to be 500 words somewhere else in the book you can write. And the book grows in like from the middle out instead of linearly.
Sounds like a very pragmatic way to write a book.
But I will say actually, the number one, I actually think the number one difference between someone who can write a book and someone who can't write a book, right, is the ability to push through the feeling while you're writing the book that it's utter crap.
The perfectionist problem.
Yeah, and like
that's what editors are for, right?
yeah, because it's usually better than you think when it gets edited. But like, there's multiple moments in writing a book where you're like, no one's ever going to read this. This is horrible. And if you can push through that, that's the difference between someone who can write a book and someone who can't write a book.
You also have to push through the computer in your pocket calling you to, watch stupid videos.
Yes.
Yeah. So pragmatism, and that's the rabbi's genius, he's saying. But let's define what you mean by pragmatism.
Yeah. So the way that I often say it is that an optimist says the glass is half full, a pessimist says the glass is half empty, a pragmatist asks, will it quench my thirst? Right? And so what is being pragmatic? Pragmatic is figuring out what works and pursuing the thing that works. And if you look at any pragmatic person, that's often going to be the case. So say, take politics, for example, right? It's the hope of getting stuff done. And so they're going to make messy compromises. They're going to choose the incremental path instead of fully embracing the thing that they want, because they're going to understand that sometimes holding out isn't going to work. They're going to do the path that is going to work. And so for the rabbis, everything about them needs Jewish law, Jewish ethics to work in their world so that Jewish law doesn't cause undue discord between people. That's chapter 6. Or chapter 5, which is work in the world with the Romans and make compromises so that they keep up good relations with the Romans, or in Babylonia, because there's 2 centers of rabbinic life, with the Sasanian Persians, right? Chapter 3 talks about leaders not leading too far in front of everyone, because sometimes if you're that far in front, people will either stop listening to you or you will break them. So good leaders need to be 1 step ahead of the people they lead, not multiple steps ahead, in order to effectively lead them. And throughout rabbinic literature, over and over again, the rabbis take that pragmatic approach. They do what works.
But isn't that like what works? Isn't that in conflict with truth with a capital T? Because if God revealed the truth, and we have the 613 weeks vote from Sinai, shouldn't it be self-evident that it will work?
So there's 2 things at play here. The first is that I don't think that the rabbis have the same definition of truth as we do. So let me define what the rabbi's definition of truth is. When we think of truth, we think of, if we had an audience with God and we could ask God what to do, God would tell us what the answer was, right? So let's take the thorniest issue nowadays, right? Abortion. And we want to know, is it ethical to abort a child at 20 weeks, right? Which is something that like in America, even people who are in the middle are trying to figure out what, like, kind of where the line is on what ethical abortion is looking like, right? And if we could, right, we would have an audience with God, and God would either say, yes, that's ethical, or no, that's not ethical. But for the rabbis, they're actually not interested in that. And so I start chapter 1 actually by talking about one of the most famous stories in Judaism, which is called the oven of Achnai. I don't know if you've ever heard the story. Anybody? No? So this is a good one.
They had been studying brachot when we were talking about the times for prayer.
Oh, yeah.
I was nodding, but sorry.
So basically the story goes like this. There's an argument about the kosherness of an oven. And all the rabbis are on one side of the debate, and there's a rabbi on the other side of the debate who disagrees with them. And basically, the rabbi who is like the solo rabbi tries everything to convince them one way or the other. He says, see this tree over there? If I'm right, let the tree uproot itself, move and replant. And the tree does that. And all the rabbis say, you can't tell the kosherness of an oven from a tree. So he says, okay, see that stream? Let it start flowing backwards. So the stream stops and starts flowing the other direction. And all the rabbis say, you can't tell the kosherness of an oven from a stream. So finally, after a few other things, he says, well, if I'm right, let God show up and say that I'm right. So God appears, right? This is what we would consider truth, like real truth, and says, look, Rabbi Eliezer's right. Like, what are you talking about? And there's another rabbi whose name is Rabbi Yehoshua, who says, God, you told us in your Torah that, quote, the Torah is not in heaven. It is yours to do with as you want. And in fact, you even gave us rules on how to decide law. And those rules say that the majority wins. Well, we are the majority. He is not the majority. In fact, if we even counted you, it'd be 2 against many. And so you're wrong on this one. And by the way, there's a postscript to the story where Rabbi Natan runs into Elijah, who's, Prophet Elijah, who tends to know stuff about heaven. And Elijah says, and he asks Elijah, what was God thinking when he got kicked out of the study hall? And Elijah said, God smiled and laughed and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Okay? So truth is, if you had an audience with God, what would the answer be? The rabbis actually feel like there's bigger things than that because it doesn't work to rely on God, right? Society has rules. God doesn't always appear. Majority rules. It is ours to make law with. And so even though the Torah is ours to use as a platform to build off of, at the end of the day, like, it doesn't, like, things don't work like that. I mean, even as long as the Torah is, and it's a pretty long book, it's not going to answer all of our questions. And so we need to end up looking at those questions about what works, what has utility. And it works better to not listen to God, but to exist in a world where law has rules. And if I have a second, I'll give one more example.
You have the whole,
So the rabbis have a really interesting challenge when they're trying to figure out what to do with settling in law, right? Now, I run a lawyer class, and settling a lawsuit, right? And so I run a lawyer class, and I said to them this, and they all laughed, and they were like, "Oh my God, like the whole point is to settle in law." And I said, "Yeah, but here's the problem, right? A judge, and remember in the ancient world, a judge was a jury. It was the same thing, right? There would be 3 judges, and they would be deciding. What a judge's task, if you really think about it, is to get as close to God's truth as possible, to hear all of the evidence, to know the law, and to figure out what they think the right answer is. But what is settling? Settling is actually doing the opposite of that. It undermines truth, if you think about it, or God's truth, right? Because 2 people are arguing. If I really truly listen, I actually might choose the plaintiff or the defendant because I think that that's actually what happened. But before I get a chance to do that, they go into another room, they make some kind of deal, they present it to me, and everybody walks away a little happy and a little unhappy, but at least they're not fighting with each other anymore, right? What is settling doing? They're dealing with pragmatic concerns. They're making sure that people aren't fighting. They're making sure not too much money gets spent. They're making sure that that, frivolous lawsuits don't hold up important lawsuits in the court, right? Settling plays a lot of different roles, and courts work because of settlements. Society works because of settlements, but it's not God's truth. It's this other pragmatic definition of truth that the rabbis hold by. By the way, it's a bit of an anachronism, but like the word pragmatic truth comes from a movement that happened in the early 1900s with these important philosophers, the only innately American philosophical school. And you might have heard these names, Pierce, Dewey, William James, people like that. And they're the ones who looked out at this world and said, actually, there's a lot more to truth than just if you had an audience with God, what would the answer be?
Mhm.
And so truth more is about what works than it is about what is, right? Yeah.
And also for them, remember from college philosophy classes, but also for them, democracy was a big part of that. That kind of truth kind of bubbled up because of the people sometimes, right?
Yes.
And so then, let's take this notion now for Jews here, for liberal Jews who don't have the same notion that as God as a commander, as obligation, as things like that. So can you have a pragmatism when everybody's kind of just doing what they want anyways? I don't know if that's a question, but that, like why should the rabbi's pragmatic decision making speak to communities of Jews that may not even be in that system? Maybe the question is, we have too much democracy.
Yeah. You mean like why pay attention to
Right, like why, like if the rabbis are trying to, so the pragmatism was to have communal norms, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to create an order in their community. How do we do, like, why does that even speak to us today when, we have no legislative power over them, right?
Yeah.
And like Jews are not necessarily, they might be thinking, oh, what pragmatically works for my Jewish life, but not for Jewish life in general.
Yeah, look, we have no power, right? That's the secret of Reform Judaism is that like you don't have to do anything we tell you to do. And that, by the way, again, that's a feature, not a bug, right? If you think about it, like the difference in the movements is that like, whereas Orthodoxy says like God and Torah have the power, right? And conservative Judaism, if you do it right, says that the conservative movement has the power. They tell you either
one committee within the committee.
One committee, yeah. They tell you can drive on Shabbat or you can't, or you can like do gay officiation or you can't. Like they figure this stuff out, right? For Reform rabbis, like we do what we want, and there's a committee called the Responsive Committee in the Reform movement. That's just for us to consult if we want some sources. I mean, like they have no power, and autonomy is right. The authority lies within the self in Reform Judaism. So you're right in the sense that like the way that the rabbis are functioning like is not something that like we're not going to look for some kind of body. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that like the reason to study Jewish law is not to get the bottom line, but rather to understand the process of thought, so that you can then apply it to your life. And I actually think that the goal of a Reformed Jew is to make decisions, but to think Jewishly as they make decisions. And I actually think that like there's a lot of different definitions of what it means to think Jewishly, right? Because you could just as easily say, I'm going to be like the prophets in the Bible who like stand on soapboxes, scream at people, and like take the moral high ground all the time. But I actually think the most authentic way to quote unquote think Jewishly is this way here that I wrote about, which is why I chose it as a topic of the book. And so I think that as you're making your individual decisions about your Jewish life, and then you're using your Jewish head to make decisions about the rest of your life, and then we as rabbis are making decisions about policy for the synagogue, I actually think the pragmatic approach is probably the most authentic and the best one to utilize.
So let's give an example of synagogue life that would, like synagogue life today, that really takes pragmatism aside.
So I'll give you a few. So one is in the social justice realm. So I truly believe that when synagogues do social justice, our job is to find a battle that has the potential to be won, and then to put our finger on the scale and to help that battle happen, right? So I'll tell you that, like, I care tremendously about immigration and about the lives of undocumented people. What I can't do, right, was stop family separation, like during the first Trump administration. Like, that wasn't going to be a thing that I had the power to do, right? But what I could do is that there was a bill in the legislature in New Jersey to allow people who are undocumented to have the right to have a driver's license, right? Or the other thing that we got involved in was, we're not going to fix criminal justice, but we were involved in a campaign called the Ban the Box campaign, which said that if you were renting to someone who was once incarcerated, only on the second round of applications could you ask about their status having been formerly incarcerated, so that you're taking a fresh look at things like previous work experience, previous previous residential experience, their ability to meet your rent and stuff like that. These are pragmatic, small steps forward. And I do think that synagogues should pick these kinds of pragmatic battles in the social justice realm. The other thing is, like, let's take intermarriage as an example, right? I think that originally, when rabbis started doing intermarriage, and both of us are too young for this original thing. I grew up in a world where, like, many rabbis I knew did it already, and I imagine you did too. You're not that much older than
I'm not that much older, but I think it just like I don't know how many of the Reform rabbis in St. Louis growing up did. Maybe when I was in college, I started. Yeah, I'm not sure.
But I at this point, why do I do interfaith officiation? I do interfaith officiation because I've seen a lot of really wonderful families, and truly believe you can have incredible families that are interfaith. And so why not? Like, why not provide that first Jewish experience for those families? Because I've confirmed plenty of amazing kids that come from interfaith families, right? So ideologically, I believe in doing this. But I have to believe that the majority of rabbis, let's say in, like, the 1990s and 1980s, when this stuff was first coming, did this for pragmatic reasons, right? I've got congregants, I don't want them mad at me. I understand that, like, if I'm gonna not lose people from Judaism, I need to embrace interfaith families. Like, there was a lot of pragmatic calculation to that. And I actually don't think that's dirty. I actually think sometimes pragmatic calculation can lead to ideological change.
Right.
And so I think that there's something to be said about this way of thinking for advancing the ball, even if sometimes it feels a little yucky when you think about it.
So then let me flip that over then. Can prophetic extremism, like the prophets you alluded to, were horrible leaders because they were just yelling at the people, right?
Yeah.
But can prophetic extremism eventually push people to make pragmatic decisions? Move the Overton window, as we say, in America. Like, is there a place for the prophet? I mean, to get very political, like, Bernie Sanders' positions are now part of the Democratic Party.
100%. I definitely think every generation needs its prophets, but every generation cannot be made up of prophets. And I think with social media, everybody sees themselves in the footprints of prophets, where you really can only have a few. And honestly, too many prophets means that it's never going to work. And even the prophetic figures that we know, for the most part, have their pragmatic streaks.
Right.
I mean, if
Martin Luther King.
That was exactly what I was going to talk about. Yeah.
He was working on legislation, right?
Yeah. And he took middle ground decisions, and he was willing to split up the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act because he couldn't pass both of them at the same time. Like, these are all, I mean, the most prophetic figures in our country still had pragmatic streaks to them. It's people who don't have that don't actually get anything done.
So let's talk, I think probably you all saw, a few days ago, a very prophetic moment where, I want to get her name right, Bishop Marion Edgar, I don't know how to say her last name, Booty,
Buddy.
Buddy, stood up to the president, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I mean, yeah, it was inspiring for people who agree with it, right? So like,
Yeah.
in a very polarized time, is that like a pragmatic thing to do? I put you on the spot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that may have actually been prophetic more than pragmatic, but there, as I said before, there is a place for that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And at the end of the day, she's now become a spokesperson for a movement, right? She wasn't gonna have power in the first place anyways, right? I mean, let's go back to the Yochanan moment. Let's assume that Yochanan didn't think he was gonna get anything ever and just thought that Vespasian was being nice to him, right? In that case, then I think you lobby for Jerusalem,
Yeah.
right? But it was because he knew he could get the thing he wanted that he went for the pragmatic decision. There is no way that she could have ever had the ability to influence policy in the Trump administration. So in that particular case, her only outlet was to be prophetic. And then that also, there was, I'm sure, a pragmatic gamble in that, because she knew she would lose any avenue toward the right, but would also become a spokesperson for the left. And in that case, once she has power, I would hope that actually she begins to utilize that power in a pragmatic way, because if she stays in the realm of profit, she'll have her 15 minutes of fame, but it won't go anywhere.
No, that's a good way of thinking about it. So in our polarized time in America, America and Israel, much of the world, right? Like, how do you break through to be pragmatic when you have to pick a team?
I mean, that's where the challenge is. That's why Yochanan, was scared on his deathbed.
Right.
It's because there is no way to ever know that you are right. The best you can do is to believe in the values that you believe in and speak out of the values that you have. And also understand two things. Number one, when most people disagree, they're disagreeing about two rights, and they're just weighing those two rights differently. What happens is I believe something, you believe something, and both of them matter, but I'm weighing this one heavier and you're weighing this one heavier, right? That's, in a perfect world, that's the way that things are going to be. And often, actually, except for the extremes of politics, I actually believe that there are two rights. Even like, let's take something that's incredibly controversial, which is people who accept the science of climate change, but still fund the fossil fuel industry, right? I'm not even going to go where people don't accept the science, right? But but imagine that, right? There actually are two rights that they're balancing. One is the long-term sustainability of the world and the environment, and the long-term economic viability of not having stronger storms and all that. The other one is understanding that there are people who can't weather the short-term sacrifices that need to be made to do the major things for climate change. And although I believe that all of us personally need to be able to make those sacrifices in order to deal with the long-term things, I understand those people who are privileging short-term economic stuff over the long term. Do you know what I mean? And so because of that, you have to give credence to the fact that both sides are coming to it with a degree of integrity, and then you're just weighing those different pieces.
Right.
There was another point I wanted to make. Remind me of the question again.
Well, in our polarized time, how do we?
How do you know you're right?
How do you know you're right? But how do we even get pragmatism on the table now? Right? Because it's really now just a team sport. I like the Eagles, I like the Giants. It's not about weighing both truths
Yeah,
or weighing both rights, as you said, right?
yeah,
No
so,
one's sitting at the table.
yeah, well, because we're a world of prophets, right?
Right.
But there are people in politics who are trying to do this, right?
Right.
Um,
The things that aren't sexy,
but it's a lot of unsexy stuff.
right?
I mean, one of the presidents that I admire the most, not for his personal life, but for his political life, was Bill Clinton, right? Because like, what did Bill Clinton do? Bill Clinton realized he couldn't get the big stuff done. I mean, he tried, he failed on healthcare, right? But what did he do? He like had a bill with like a little extra funding for firefighters. And then he passed like dozens and dozens and dozens of those kinds of bills. And actually you kind of blink, and after a whole term of passing those small things, he advanced the ball pretty significantly in a lot of different ways. And I think that like, look, we might just be too broken right now,
Yeah.
but eventually the pendulum is going to swing and people are going to have to figure out how to work together.
So I want to bring it back to the rabbis in a second, but then the question, kind of a definitional question, is there a difference between pragmatism and moderation? You're calling for moderation.
Yeah.
Because, we can't all be prophets, right? But like, why not just say, oh, well, let's just be in the squishy middle about everything, right? And that's what I would say moderation is.
Yeah, but the rabbis were incredibly radical in their pragmatism, right? When I think of moderation, I think of somebody who like tiptoes into the world, right?
Right.
I mean, I'll give you examples. They destroy whole sections of the Torah. So like the rabbis look around and they say to themselves, you know what? It's not going to work, right? That's the key, the work. It's not going to have utility. It's not going to work in our day and age for parents to stone their rebellious children, even though it says it in Deuteronomy. So, but we can't change the Torah because the Torah is from God. So what are we going to do? We're going to read the Torah in such a way that we actually undo that law. And the way that they do that is first they say to themselves, okay, if they're a son, if they're called a son, they must be a minor. But if they're held accountable for their actions, they must be of majority age, meaning over the age of 13. So let's say they're between 12 and a half and 13 and they've already begun puberty, right? That narrows the field. Then they say, okay, well, the Torah calls them a glutton and a drunkard. Well, if they're a glutton, let's define the amount that they've eaten so that no one can actually eat that much. And if they're a drunkard, let's define the amount that they've drank where no one can actually drink that much. And so eventually, by defining the words in such a way, they get to the point where they can say, never has there been and never will there be a ben sorer umoreh, which is the Hebrew word for the insolent and rebellious son. That's incredibly radical. They did it because it wouldn't work to have a society like that, right? That's pragmatism. But it didn't mean that they didn't just do something that was wildly creative and out there. And they do this all the time. I'll give you another example. There is in the Torah, it says very clearly that if you lend money every 7 years, you have to forgive the debts of someone, right? So that doesn't work because in year 6, people aren't going to start lending because it was a 7-year cycle. It wasn't the term of the loan. There was actual dates. So in year 6, no one's going to lend. But as we know, right, raising interest rates, right, that completely would upend society to have lending ground to a halt. So what happens? They figure out a loophole whereby you give the loan over to the courts. So they hold the loan when year 6 transitions to year 7. And then because you weren't in possession of the loan and the person who's owed the money doesn't own the loan at the time, somehow that makes it null and void. And then after the 7th year ends, they give the loan back to you and then the cycle starts over again, right? The reason they do that is because they realize the Torah doesn't work for them anymore. Incredibly radical, but able to make a huge change and to make it work for them. And by the way, like super unsexy, right? Like these are like usually like prophets are much sexier than these pragmatic rabbis who are like fiddling with all of these different intricacies of law. Yeah, but actually, like it's the way laws work.
And I think Jeremiah was a stickler from the first Shemitah too. So,
yeah,
right. So,
yeah.
So But does that mean that like Judaism might not stand for anything because you could just kind of figure out a way to make it work, right? Shouldn't there be some, like I'll be extreme right now, shouldn't there be something eternal about it that that doesn't change?
Yeah. So what I'll say two things, right? Number one, the thing to understand is that pragmatism is a tool, it is not an end, right? So there are some really bad people in the Torah who are pragmatic. I would say the most pragmatic person in the whole Torah was King Achashverosh, who in my mind might be as evil, if not more, in the Purim story than Haman, right? Haman was singular-minded. He wanted to destroy the Jews. Achashverosh wanted to do what was beneficial to Achashverosh. And so when Haman said, can you give me the keys to the kingdom so I can destroy the Jews? He said, sure. And at the end, when Mordechai, after kind of vanquishing Haman, said, can I have the keys to the kingdom to kill 50,000 people in revenge for what Haman was going to do? He gave him the keys and said, sure, right? That was incredibly pragmatic on his part because he wanted to reserve his power and all that. That's not good. Pragmatism is a tool. It is a tool to advance some end, but it's not the end in itself. For Achashverosh, the end was his own power and prestige. For us, for Jews, the end, and for the rabbis, it's about advancing the ethics of Torah. It's about advancing good in the world. It's about advancing God's place in the world. And so you use these pragmatic tools, incrementalism, willingness to change, willing to get your hands dirty for those things. Now, I end the book actually exactly addressing this question. So chapter 8 is the most problematic chapter in the book, I think, because I talk about, it's called sinning for the greater good. And it's about all the things that the rabbis felt like you could do bad in order in the end to do good, right? And so, for example, they countenance murdering someone in order to save another person's life, or murdering someone who is going to inform on you to the Roman government in order to keep the Romans from like persecuting the Jews, right? And all of that is in play, all that's part and parcel of the rabbinic world, and it feels really wrong. And the problem is that people have taken some of those precepts to the extreme. So I end that chapter by talking about Yigal Amir, who's the person who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. And Yitzhak Rabin, right? Like after he gets killed, they find the testimonial of Yigal Amir, who uses the terms that I just spoke about. Killing someone to save another person's life is called a rodef. Killing an informant is called a moser, right? And he calls Yitzhak Rabin a moser and a rodef. And so I end that chapter by saying the thing that he didn't realize is that Judaism has these broader ethical ideas and principles that he didn't use as a check against his pragmatism. And so chapter 9 is called a hedge around pragmatic thinking. And so it's possible, according to like a biblical commentator called Nachmanides, to be what is called a scoundrel within the bounds of law. And I think we all know people who law allows you to do something, so you do bad things. To give you an example, I start that chapter by talking about a Rabbi Kahuna, who has a group of people who are moving like jugs of wine for him. And one of them breaks one of the jugs of wine, right? And he is within his right to take the value of those jugs of wine. Now, the porter who was moving the wine was really poor. He really only had the shirt on his back. So Kahuna takes the shirt off his back as a way to say, you owe me this. And another rabbi comes and says, even though technically law would allow you to do this, you need to go above the law. And in Hebrew, it's called lifnim mishurat hadin, going above the plane, like the baseline of what's required of you. And being a mensch. And there's tons of examples in the Talmud of these kind of checks against pragmatic thinking. There's a precept called doing what is right and good. And there's examples of that. There's this other precept that says if law allows you to do something, but you think God would judge you for it, right? Then you need to also take into account what God might think of you if you're doing wrong. There's all, and so you take all of those into account, and suddenly you've got at least the path you're walking. And so pragmatism is the tool to advance you to get further on that path, more than it's a way around the path itself.
So I'm gonna, one more question.
Yeah.
And then we'll take a few minutes for questions from you all. And so I'm gonna ask you to be a prophet, I guess. But
Yeah.
what do you see? What's an issue that the Jewish community needs to be thinking more pragmatically about right now?
Interesting. So I'm not going to give the answer that I gave on the podcast.
Everybody listened to, he gave a great interview on a podcast the other day, Tablet Magazine's podcast, but
Yeah,
I won't give it away.
yeah. I mean, yeah. By the way, the answer that I gave there was about what to do a generation from now when all of these kids who are Jewish and anti-Zionists end up wanting to join the congregation, and how much space to give to them. And I don't know the answer, by the way, of what to do.
You gave
but
a
that-
very pragmatic answer.
But that is going to be a pragmatic decision that we're gonna need to make, because you can't turn a whole generation of Jews away if they think differently than you, right? Well, I'll just say that, yeah. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what the answer is. But assuming that they don't change their opinion, how can a congregation who is proudly Zionist needs to stay proudly Zionist, but they somehow need to also create a space where these people can feel comfortable coming in. And I don't know, like, I'm scared of the day when I have to figure that out, but I actually do think that you're gonna need to use every pragmatic tool at your disposal to figure it out.
Well, I mean, 100
maybe
a
there'll be
100 years
another
ago, there were
party.
congregations that split over the question of Zionism, and there was the Zionist congregation and the
The
non-Zionist.
second one.
Right, but
Yeah. I mean,
That's right.
I would say anything that pushes the boundary, like you're ultimately going to need to figure out. To give you another example, and this is going to sound really morbid, but I actually think a good number of conservative synagogues are going to be folding in the next generation.
For sure.
And unless the conservative movement changes things. And they're not going to get assumed by another conservative synagogue, because they're just going to be too geographically spread out.
especially in a place like New Jersey, where each small town has one or the other, right?
Yeah, you're going to find a lot of Reform synagogues merging with conservative synagogues, and that's going to be interesting. And I actually don't.
Near Tommy.
That was near to me in 1980. Yeah. We ended up in the Reform movement solely because we got kicked out of the conservative movement.
Oh, wow, that part I didn't know.
We pushed the boundary too much on interfaith stuff, which is like a great reason actually to get out of the conservative movement. in my
Good for
opinion.
you.
Was that Rabbi Kushner
Yeah.
at the time?
Yeah.
Good for you.
But I do think actually like pragmatism is going to come into play as you're thinking about like, okay, so like, who is my body? Like, who are my congregants? And even though I ideologically believe certain things, like, let's say I have a huge influx of people who want to see certain pieces of the service that we don't currently do, right? And most of our congregants don't come on Saturday morning, but actually like a large number of the new conservative congregants do. Like, I don't really want to do 7 Aliyot, but for pragmatic reasons, I may actually do it to serve them better, right? And so I do think actually that's going to come into play a lot too.
Didn't we find that with the prayer book when it was redone
Yeah.
like May team, which was
Yeah.
not in
Right.
the old prayer
For
book?
sure.
And
And that I think that was like when Mishkan Tefillah was being made, I was in rabbinical school, and like one of the editors talked about
Please.
a lot of the conservative Jews leaving the conservative movement and coming into the Reform movement over the last 25 years, and how that's influenced things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Questions from you all? Mark.
It occurs to me that the balance between accommodation and appeasement, and that seems to be the tipping point, is to appeasement is not good, but pragmatism is. How do you walk the line with those definitions?
I mean, appeasement is accommodation without any power, right? I think nobody appeases because they want to. Most people appease because they have to, right? And the rabbis do this all the time. I'll give you one example, which is, you know, I have a section in there about the king making pedestals to put idols on. And even though the idols weren't there all the time, the pedestals stuck around and reminded people about idolatry, right? At the end of the day, the rabbis figure out a way to be okay with those pedestals around their locale. But the reason they did that is not because they ideologically feel some way about idolatry. It's because they had enough power to tell the Romans that they couldn't do that. Accommodation works very differently because you have some power and you're utilizing the power for some other good. So you might, for example, give in to somebody because you want to preserve, capital for something else, or because you would rather direct your energy in a different direction. And I do think both of them exist in rabbinic literature. And I do think actually, like, sometimes we've forgotten what it's like to have existential issues in Judaism. I even think that, like, things that people think are existential issues in Judaism are not necessarily that. Like, people who say that, like, the war in Gaza is an existential threat to, like, existential issue in Israel. Iran with the nuclear bomb is an existential threat, right? But, like, for the most part, Hezbollah, Hamas, these are not existential threats. Judaism is full of existential threats over the course of time. Whole Jewish communities that could easily be wiped away because of the whim of some leader.
Only 80 years ago.
What?
Only 80 years ago.
Only 80 years ago, yeah. And so I do think that actually, like, the rabbis give models because sometimes they've got more power than others. And so they give multiple different models throughout rabbinic literature of times when appeasement is required and then times when acquiescence is required, or pragmatic moderation, or whatever you want to say in that regard.
I'm thinking Neville Chamberlain,
Yeah,
um,
though Neville Chamberlain probably had more power and then didn't utilize that power.
that was the ultimate judgment was, he
Yeah.
had more power than he thought. And he messed up.
Yeah,
You started off by talking about integrity and
Yeah.
the fact that you couldn't really focus on that because the Nazis had integrity, but you moved to pragmatism. But you also gave examples of, and we can think of many, of pragmatic decisions that are unethical or immoral, and you spoke about that. So as Jews, don't we have to modify that term pragmatism in terms of how we apply it and speak about moral pragmatism
yes,
rather than just pragmatism?
yes. So I often will use the word in there, moral pragmatism, but that's very fair and that's true, right? The goal is to advance the moral ball using pragmatism as a tool to do that. 100%.
Just a practical question. In the beginning, again, you spoke about integrity and you said you did research on it. You went around and around thinking about it. What type of research does a rabbi do?
You read books, scholarly books on the topic and stuff like that. Yeah.
But do you go all to the Talmud or the Torah? Or
Oh,
do you-
no, I mean, you read secondary literature and stuff like that too. Yeah, but yes, I did go to the Talmud on that issue.
As I've shown you all, there's many tools you could use. You can,
yeah.
all of classical Jewish literature, you can now search online, with Sefaria. So it's much easier for us to do this than it was, even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So you could sit at home, use Google and basically get the information to write this book.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
With the rabbinic sources.
Right.
Yeah, you can get the rabbinic sources easy.
It's
Yeah.
like PubMed. It's like PubMed for scientists.
So we're starting the Mishnah with a rabbi on Saturdays, which I've never really looked at before. And my first take on it is it's not pragmatic at all. Because it just seems the minutia and the around and around trying to get to the point. It seems like they are struggling for that God's eye view.
Isn't in part that's the pragmatism, devil's in the details?
And I to me, like the example you gave about the, why you can't murder your son.
Yeah.
A pragmatic approach to me would have been, you can't murder your son. As opposed to, yeah, so.
Yeah, well, because their version of pragmatism, they're handcuffed by one really important piece,
Okay.
which is
What?
they can't change the words of the Torah, right? So whereas I, for example, can easily say, as a Reform rabbi, see this line, it was true for the people who wrote it, it's not true for me, so I'm going to abandon it.
Fair enough.
The rabbis believe truly that this is God's word. And so if this is God's word, they can't touch the text itself. And they also can't say this text isn't important. They need to do it. They need to give credence to the text. So, and by the way, their way of thinking is a way that modern Orthodox Jews sometimes think too. So, the example that I often use is Leviticus 18:22 says, if one man lies with another man as he lies with a woman, it's an abomination.
Mm.
I don't try. I just look at that and I say, doesn't apply. I'm
Yeah.
like, that was true for them, not true for me. I'm good, right? I don't need this. But like an Orthodox Jew can't do that. And so if you read the first real testament about kind of defending gay Jews in the Orthodox world, which is by a rabbi named Stephen Greenberg, called Wrestling with God and Man is the name of the book. What he does is he does the same thing the rabbis do. He looks at the word shachav, which means to lie down, and he says, in most places in the Torah, the word shachav probably actually means violence, because lying down in most cases, when you find that somebody lies down with another, it's a euphemism for rape. And so what this text is actually saying is that one man shall not violently hurt another man sexually, not like one man can't have a consensual sexual relationship with another man. Therefore, because I've never raped anybody, I can be gay, right? And that's the point he makes in the book. And he wouldn't be able to do that without the creativity of the rabbis.
Interpretation.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Well,
Is that a distinction without a difference though?
no, I would, well, sorry.
Yeah.
He's asking.
Yeah. So say more.
Well, you have a certain, it seems like you want to adhere to this form or it's kind of ideal because it says so in the text. And you're doing all these backflips to justify it. And then you come out on the other end with what you want anyway.
Yeah.
To me, maybe we're all Reformed Jews in a way. I mean, that's what I'm getting at. Without the unpragmatic process of kind of just saying,
Yeah.
I'm good.
So my father-in-law was the first person to read this book. And because he was the one who gave me the Yochanan gamble idea. And he also
Is he a rabbi?
No,
He's just a
no.
guy.
He's just a guy.
Actually, like just like us.
And he finished, he's a modern Orthodox Jew, and he finished, he goes, oh, I now get you Reformed Jews. You base your, like, you're kind of rabbinic Jews, like, you see yourself in the footsteps of the rabbis. And I was like, exactly. And so I believe that there have been two cauldrons of Jewish history. And this is I think what you're getting at. And meaning, like, think about glass, right? If you try to mold glass and glass is cold, it breaks. But if you heat glass up, you can mold glass in lots of different ways, right? And so there's two times in Jewish history that I think are cauldrons. Number one is the destruction of the temple creates a kind of malleability in Judaism that allows the rabbis to do what they do, right? The other cauldron of Jewish history is Jews and modernity, right? For most of Jewish history, Jews don't count. They're not citizens, they're not part of the world. Early 1800s, Napoleon asked a group of people called the Sanhedrin, group of elders in Paris. Here's 8 questions about Jews and France. If you answer them all right, we'll make you citizens. They answer 7 correctly and punt on the 8th. The 8th was, would you marry a French Christian girl? They're like, we'll talk about that later. And they weren't quite ready for that yet. And from there, Jews enter into modernity, right? And modernity births three different approaches. Number one are the people who flee Judaism because they finally have an in the world, right? Then there's a hardening of people who say, we don't want this modern thing. We're going to just be Jewish, right? That gives birth eventually to ultra orthodoxy, right? And then you have the scope of the middle ground approach, which is originally Reform, but like goes all the way to modern Orthodox, but it's about, we want both. We want modernity, we want Judaism, and now we're gonna weigh them in different ways, which is the difference between Reform and modern Orthodox, but we want both of them. We wanna be able to have both. And so I actually think that like, moments that are really hot like that necessitate that kind of creativity. And Reform Judaism was not the same approach of the rabbis because they had a different set of assumptions and a different set of forces acting on them. But I do believe that both of them are authentic expressions in their time of what it looks like to try to make Judaism work in a really hot, changing world.
So you're kind of describing Judaism, at least some portion of it, as being a living, growing religion.
Yes.
Can you make some comparisons to other religions?
I'm not sure I know enough about other religions to necessarily know that. I do believe lots of religions change, right? You know, and like Christianity in America doesn't look the same now as it did a couple generations ago.
It's just,
And yeah,
it depends on what community
What
is self-conscious
part of-
about it too, right?
Yeah.
I think I really like what
Story
you
you tell
said
yourself,
about
why
the
you change.
hotness, because I think all traditions
Yeah.
have to face the hotness. And they change. There's very progressive Christian people, there are very progressive Buddhist people. There are Buddhist people that, you know, kill Muslims, I mean, all the time. So I think each tradition has similar reactions.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
So there's some applicability
For sure,
for sure.
and
right.
across
Well,
non-religious life. just
and I think,
politics.
you know, I think ultimately, like, the book is a model of how, about Jewish being in the world and how we as a community can be a model for other beings in the world, right? And you know, we Jews are only 2% maybe of American society, but like, I think the way our communities can model themselves as a place of discussion and a place of pragmatism and a place of holding different kinds of truths or rights, you said, right?
Yeah.
Together it can be a model.
And we have an outside platform for 2%.
Maybe.
Because there's so much focus on us, clearly.
Yeah,
We have more power than we think.
it's true. And I think, you know, we being conscious of the power that we have and not being scared of it is important too.
Although we're continuously blamed for it.
Yeah, it's true. But
All right.
thank you very much.
Of course, thank you.
Very good, thank you.
We have books back there.
And I'm happy to sign it.
Are you going for the pen?
Yes, yes.
no, it's about, I see that all the time, and actually.
I have a lot of ideas.